and pass it over to Cindy.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Cindy Eisenberg, and I'd just like to welcome you to our 6th East Bay Supper Club of 2020 and our second one on Zoom. And I have to say that it feels very, very strange to not be sitting around a dinner table. But I am very happy to welcome Marcia back to the Supper Club, where she has been a frequent and very popular speaker. And she has also been a speaker at numerous other IWF NorCal events, such as the Economic Forecast Dinner. As I was preparing for this, I reflected on how long I've known Marcia, and we've known each other for about 15 years. We share a couple of mutual connections. One is South Dakota. Marcia grew up there. And I have been engaged in environmental restoration projects, including in expanding bison herds for the Native Americans for about the last 2 decades. In addition to South Dakota, we both share a keen interest in the environment. And Marcia's concern for the environment is embedded in her work and her commitment to ESG investing. I am really impressed with her trajectory that took her from rural America to the international stage as a global strategist. Along the way, she acquired a PhD in German studies and fine art at Vanderbilt and had a successful career in journalism. As a journalist at the Tennessean, Marcia developed her core belief in the importance of transcending geographic and cultural boundaries. Her years as a reporter and editor led her to politics and public affairs, and subsequently to Asian business and finance. Recently, the Singapore Times featured a long essay on Marcia's career and her accomplishments, and I recommend it to you. It was included as a copy in today's reminder. And I'm just going to share a few of her career highlights. She's the past CEO of the Pacific Pension and Investment Institute. Through 2019, she was a director of Tata Capital Singapore at a time when the conglomerate was undergoing a massive reorganization. Currently, she is a lifetime member of the prestigious Council on Foreign Relations, and she is a member of the President's Leadership Council of the Asia Foundation. Additionally, she is a director of the Japan Society of Northern California, and she continues as a member of the International Financial Forum, which is a China-based think tank. She's a director of the RAND Center for Asia Pacific Policy. And in 2014, she became a director of Quantum Advisors Mumbai, which focuses on emerging markets and plans to be a global player. So I would say that Marcia is very well qualified to lead our discussion. Marcia, why don't you take it away?
Thank you, Sydney, very much. I too regret not being around your dinner table in the East Bay. It's much more congenial, but it's an opportunity to come together on a topic that's obvious of interest to all of you and certainly of interest to me. And that's really the interrelationship of various events and circumstances that are focused right now by COVID-19. So Marcia, why don't we roll to the first slide, so I put this slide up to start with by way of saying that the next 2 slides are preliminary, and you are very welcome to get up and go and get yourself a glass of wine or a scotch or whatever it is that is your favorite libation, because the news is not good news. And we all need a little respite sometimes from the news. But actually, it's the saturation of the COVID news that brings me to my topic with all of you today. And let me just say thank you for taking an hour out of your time and your afternoon. I'm up here in Napa, sitting on the back deck, where every now and then the wind will come and flip my papers. So if I go rushing off the screen, that's what I've done, is gone to collect my papers. But thank you all for joining. And like I say, do get yourself a glass of wine or whatever you like. I'm drinking water until after our conversation. it may feel like we are in a vacuum. I mean, we're so saturated with the COVID-19 news. It's just everywhere we turn. And for many days, if you still get a newspaper delivered, you'd notice that there's nothing but COVID at all reported on. But the truth is, we are not in a vacuum with COVID. There are other things that are going on that are going to have a great effect on how we live our lives, certainly the rest of this year. And I wanted to, in our conversation, call attention to what I see as 2 or 3 of the major things that are happening in conjunction with this sheltering in place, this dealing with the public health emergency, and that are in some ways related and affected, certainly by the decisions that are being made around COVID. So I offer you these 5 questions, and I'm going to come back to them at the end of our conversation, because I would really like us, the best we can, and understanding the format, but the best we can, to have an exchange, because I hope at the end of our time together, you go away with some, you're intrigued by some of this and you'll think further, because I think it's very important for the life of our, for our own individual lives and the life of our country, really. So I would ask you to think, what is our larger perspective on America now that we are hopefully at mid-crisis? What does governance look like to us today, given what we've been going through and what we've listened to, what we participated in? What are the legitimate expectations of our economy? And then, as it may seem far afield, but China is really a part of this story, and I hope to show you how should we even have a relationship with China? Where at the end of the day do we go from here? COVID has, has taken over in so many ways. This particular shot was made when it was breaking out all over Europe. So you'll see the biggest circle and the biggest focus right there on Western Europe. The statistics at that time and since then are really quite sobering. As of 2 days ago, as of May 17, there were a total of, get this, 4.7 million confirmed cases, 315,183 deaths. Now, I can just tell you that is 25 times the population of the town in South Dakota that I grew up in. In the US, the number of deaths is 89,426. That is very substantial. New cases just since May 17 are 79,552. And deaths as of just 2 days ago is 3,404. There have been 74 corporations that have defaulted on their loans so far this year. Just last week, there were 7. That included Hertz in New Jersey, Revlon in New York, and Petra Diamonds in Bermuda. Banks which entered this crisis with great liquidity, great buffers, strong capital, and were very profitable in the decades, saw their earnings decline by 70% in the first quarter. Now they've recovered a good bit of that since then, but that first quarter was jaw-dropping. This slide here on your screen is based on data from Johns Hopkins University, which is really the source for data on COVID. And I offer it here to show you the difference in what is happening in 2 key countries in the country, China and the US. The turquoise line that you see crawling across the bottom of the screen shows China, what's happened with the incidence of cases in China. It is really leveled off and is declining just a very little bit. The dark blue line, however, purplish dark blue line, which is going straight up almost at a, 25, almost straight up but to the right, is in the US, the number of cases in the US. It's really been a dramatic increase. Could we have the next slide, Marcia? This is where this is where it started. This fellow, Dr. Li, was an ophthalmologist in Wuhan in central China. He was the one who really was responsible, in all likelihood, for the very early days of the information that was made. It was shared between him and his friends, but it ended up being made public. It was information about what he suspected in the hospital where he worked in Wuhan. He was seeing a rise in the number of cases that were strangely related to a pneumonia-like illness. He probably on WeChat contacted his friends and colleagues and told them what he was seeing. And it was that point of contact that was caused him to be detained by authorities, and ultimately he recanted his suspicions. The information got out, as you might imagine that it would, and he ended up being a public hero whistleblower across China, among people across China. The reason I bring him up in this particular instance is because it was through him that this information first became public knowledge. The initial reaction on the part of the Chinese authorities was to play it down, was to cover it up and then play it down. When his exchange with his colleagues became known, the authorities stepped up their game and they couldn't control the information any longer. The virus was starting to move too rapidly and they had to move. And what was interesting to look at how they responded then versus back 17 years ago in 2002 with the SARS epidemic, when they kept it under wraps for much longer, the Chinese authorities' handling of the SARS crisis became a very serious boomerang for them internationally. It was a very embarrassing, difficult set of circumstances that had not, of a proportion that was not as great as had not been seen since Tiananmen Square in 1989. So it was a very serious set of circumstances inside China for China's relationship with other countries, and it caused the rest of the world, it allowed the rest of the world to really see inside some of the difficulties with the Chinese institutions shrouded in their secrecy. I'm just going to go off here. Shrouded in their secrecy. But the Chinese, having learned from the SARS episode in 2002, now in 2019, 2020, acted very quickly. And hence they shut down Wuhan very, very quickly. They made all citizens wear some kind of bracelet that tracked whether they tracked their temperatures, tracked who they were in contact with. They were able to do the contact tracing. They quarantined people, they restricted movement seriously, and they were able to really bring the virus under control. Meanwhile, of course, it had started its lethal march around the world. Could we have the next slide, Marcia? This is a cartoon from The Economist that ran early on in the COVID crisis debate, and I offer it here in contrast to how the Chinese dealt with the early stages of the virus. It quickly became, as the virus was marching out of China and it was hitting South Korea, it was starting to hit Japan, it was in Singapore, and it had moved into Europe, it was moving into other parts of the world, and it was moving into the United States at a rapid pace. And it quickly became clear that the US was not ready. President Trump was very slow to absorb the scale of the risk. He focused instead on controlling the message and protecting the gains of the economy since he had taken office. He also didn't trust what he was hearing from others, and he undercut the message he was getting from officials as early as January 30th. The consequence of his refusal to absorb the scale of the risk is that he forced the health of the public to compete with economic and political concerns that were internal to his White House. This slowed the path to congressional stimulus, about the ability to obtain the necessary supplies that were needed to keep up with the spreading virus, addressing the shortfalls in testing, and ultimately taking the steps that were necessary to ensure that the country stayed home and was safe. On his mind, of course, was re-election. So was the long-running dispute inside the administration on how to deal with China. People in the markets were starting to worry that even a phase 1 agreement would never see the light of day. At first, the virus took a back seat so as not to upset the trade talks. But then the blame game came and took over as China advanced its own mask diplomacy internationally. Trump charged the Chinese could have let the world public know sooner, but worse, he spread the unsubstantiated rumor that the virus came from a Wuhan research laboratory, an allegation that has been roundly disputed from multiple directions. It was left up to America's doctor, here we see him in a very early picture, Tony Fauci, to deliver the message to Americans, so many of us who were on edge. He bridged the virus-related public comments and the tweets of an erratic, self-serving, inexperienced president with a penchant to throw out any and all who disagreed with him. The next slide, Marcia. What followed was an unhappy series of missteps, failures in judgment and inaction. An uncertain and unmarked path to testing was one of the unhappy series of missteps. When the WHO had offered tests to the CDC, the agency turned them down with a preference for domestic tests that it turned out were faulty. The incident was a serious setback with immeasurable proportions in what we now know has to be the strategy: widespread testing, contact tracing, quarantine, and/or treatment. There was also the stupefying crisis over insufficient protective gear and hospital capacity, forcing one group of nurses to use kitchen baggies to protect themselves. The image went viral, as you might imagine. It turned out that the supply chains making the protective masks and the other gear either originated or passed supply chains that were undergoing disruption as a result of the US-China trade dispute. There was also a push at warp speed to get to a vaccine. And we had many reports about what was happening with Gilead's remdesivir, and then the Moderna vaccine labs, hydrochloroquine, and don't forget the bleach. Thinking about Moderna, there was an announcement yesterday that many of you probably saw, suggesting that billions of federal dollars that had been thrown at a vaccine may be paying off. It was reported that Moderna, the Cambridge, Massachusetts biotech company that is in partnership with the National Institute of Health on their phase 1 studies, had developed a vaccine and tried it out with positive results at some, but not all levels of the medication. And if you pay attention to the markets, you'll note that yesterday they went wild, closed up some 900 points, and then today held on to those gains. It was just the night before, if you watch 60 Minutes, Jerome Powell, the Fed Reserve Chairman, had told Americans, for the economy to fully recover, people will have to be fully confident, and that may have to await the arrival of a vaccine. And of course, that's what the markets were thinking, if markets think, but that's what the markets were reacting to yesterday with the news from Moderna. I read the news, but with a note of caution to myself, knowing that this is a test that's had positive results, but there's not been a peer review as is required. The peer review requirement process has not taken place. And there are some questions around Moderna and its penchant for gutsiness, as well as some secrecy. In December 2018, it was the largest IPO in the biotech company history, and then it raised $600 million on just 8% of the company. None of that is a problem, but it is a question. None of their products have been made it to final phase trials yet, but it is still good news that we don't want to throw cold water on. Let's hope that it turns out the way they say it's going to turn out. Could we have the next slide, Marcia? Through all this, it was I love this cartoon because it says, it's a picture that says 1,000 words. It's really where the president and the White House were from the very beginning, once they acknowledged the scope of the threat that faced us. Their concerns were protecting the gains that the economy had realized in the first 3 years of his presidency, and they could see what was happening as a result of the virus's spread. He was eager first to get the country back open. By Easter, when he was disabused of that notion, he continued to push and push hard in multiple ways. There were some key dimensions that contribute to the context of Mr. Trump's impatience. On March 11th, he said on national TV that he was banning travel from 26 European countries. The curious thing is he left out the United Kingdom. And at that point, he was seen eye to eye with Boris Johnson on the issue of social distancing and wearing masks. But he left out the UK and banned the travel from the other countries, from the other 26 countries, on the same day that the WHO declared a global pandemic. He still wasn't quite in step with what was really happening, with the scope of what was happening. Then on March 13, he did declare the national emergency in the US. Finally, it was more than a month after the first cases of coronavirus had been detected in Seattle, traced to a traveler from Wuhan, China, to the state of Washington. It was only then, in mid-March, that Mr. Trump offered a semblance of a national strategy. He allowed the federal government to engage its efforts to hasten mass testing, improve the availability of medical supplies, and he encouraged all citizens to radically alter their behavior to arrest the virus's speed. He was asked at one point in a press conference about the critical shortage of face masks that was being reported so widely, and replied, "I just don't take responsibility at all." And then on March 17, as he announced the border closures with Mexico and Canada, in addition to the European closures, and of course he had closed the entry of Chinese early on in the pandemic, he replied again to a reporter's question about his quickness to respond to the pandemic. He suggested that actually he had known it was a pandemic long before it was called a pandemic. Then on March 27, a few days, 10 days later, he signed the CARES Act to curb COVID's impact and move things forward. But still could we have the next slide, Marcia? Still we were at a point where we had a very fragmented national strategy. And it rolled really to the governors and to the local officials to deal with COVID and the pandemic, and they have been dealing with it at various levels in various ways. We've had Governor Newsom in California and Governor Cuomo in New York established coalitions to coordinate reopening their regions, and all based around three principles. Public health is number one, a positive health outcome, and science, not politics, has to be the guide to reopening, and states have to work together. And as of the last 2 days, almost all the states are in some stage of reopening, and local leaders are taking various actions. The bars are opening in Houston. In Kentucky, contact tracing is being stepped up. In Illinois, it's now a misdemeanor to open a business in violation of public health standards. And in Colorado, the governor is urging the White House and Mr. Trump to use his bully pulpit to encourage people to continue wearing masks. Taken together, this prickly relationship between the White House and the governor's houses in the US illustrated, at least for me, the larger conflict over what is the government's purpose, particularly when there are competing interests, the public's health and welfare, and the economic interests and challenges of finding suitable compromises that require a steady and seasoned hand at the wheel. Instead of a federal strategy with leadership and coordination with others on the front line, America's experience in the early stages of dealing with COVID also suggested we were experiencing an even deeper polarization of our country. Next slide, Marcia. The debate to close or not to close was very much with each and every one of us. And then, of course, we had, with some, it was not a concern. And so, oh well. Meanwhile, the great divide that we saw happening, that we are still experiencing, we saw beginning that we're still experiencing, as illustrated in this cover from the Economist, on the next slide, there we go. It's illustrated in this cover in the Economist, illustrates the difference between how Wall Street has been reacting to what we've been going through, and how Main Street, what is happening as a result of what is happening on Main Street. We've had an unprecedented stimulus in two primary forms. The Federal Reserve has done a cut interest rates to near zero on March 3rd, and then again on March 15th. It's had another round of quantitative easing, and it's put in place an interesting framework for buying corporate and municipal bonds. In Congress, as we know, there's been an unprecedented fiscal stimulus package, a $2 trillion package with a $1,200 payment for taxpayers who earn up to $75,000 a year. It's been money for small and big business, including Boeing aircraft, public health services, state and local governments, and a safety net. A critical driver was the rate at which unemployment has climbed, now a little over 14%, and with some suggesting, including the Fed governor, the Fed chairman, that it could reach the proportions of the Great Depression, 25%. In California, I might note it's 18%, expected to reach 18%, according to Governor Newsom. Meanwhile, we've had Wall Street unable to come up with a clear message on how it is reading the public health risk. As I noted, then March 9th, the markets dropped a record 30%, and then on March 18, they were up with the news that Moderna Biotech had possibly discovered a vaccine that could work. This slide showing Jim Cramer, it's a little fuzzy, but this slide showing Jim Cramer reporting the Dow's best week since 1938 at the same time that the ticker moves across the screen about the number of Americans losing their jobs in a space of 3 weeks sums up a lot of the great divide as illustrated in that Economist cover. Excuse me. This clip from the Wall Street Journal illustrates the different kinds of ways the economy can improve, or it can go forward from where we are. Let's hope it's improving. It could be a V-shaped recovery with a quick dive and then a quick rise again to the level it was at before it dropped. That's the hope. Many think there could be a U-shaped recovery, and there's a lot of debate over how long we stay in the lower part of the U. I tend to see the W-shaped recovery as the most likely, and because I think there is a possibility of a recurrence of the virus, possibly in the fall, but later on. But let's hope that's not the case. Let's hope it's the V, and that the V is happens very quickly. You can tell I love these Economist cartoons, but the flip side of that $2 trillion stimulus, and this is important for all of us, the flip side of that $2 trillion stimulus is the possible addition of, and the possible addition of another $3 trillion in stimulus is what happens to our debt. it's an issue that divides policymakers into two really distinct black and white camps. Those that are willing to say, those who say that as long as inflation is as low as it is, borrow the money you need to get through the recovery. The recovery will produce the growth you need that pays the debt back. The other camp says debt is debt is debt, and we're short-circuiting the economic future of future generations. It's clear, the stimulus is going to result in a doubling of our debt, already roughly equivalent to the size of the economy. And with the addition of another 3 trillion, it will take it even higher. I might add that $3 trillion in additional stimulus has passed the House, but is, last I read, stalled still in the Senate, controlled by the Republicans. So remembering that all of this about COVID is not happening in a vacuum, there's also the oil crisis that we may have paid attention to, but may have been covered up by everything else we had our eyes on. So what is this about, and what is its relevance? Well, briefly, in mid-April, there was a flap that was started by the Russians and the Saudis over the price of oil and the amount of oil that was going to be produced, or could be, that was going to be allowed to be produced under the agreements of OPEC. The disagreement pushed the price of oil onto a downhill slide that affected US and international oil markets in multiple ways, but primarily drove the price of oil down to below $23 a barrel. It's now stabilized at around $40 a barrel, but that's a far cry, and this is why it's important. It's a far cry from the price tag many countries in our still interdependent world, the price tag that many depend on for their oil exports to fund their budgets, countries like Nigeria and Mexico. It also undercuts the lucrative shale industry in the US. The low prices are also, I might add, an indicator, in my opinion, of an important change in behavior when it comes to how we use oil as a society. We are in the process of reducing our carbon footprint. The pace at which we're doing so is the question. And it's a response to fears about global warming. Unless we're able to slow the rate of increase in the planet's temperature, we will face severe dislocation, in my view. And now, and as the storyline goes, it could trigger the potential for an even bigger crisis with fewer resources to deal with the problem. This cartoon really tells it all once again. The preliminary round, as you see here, is between the world and the COVID pathogen, and the world is dealing a blow to COVID, hopefully knocking it down, with climate change waiting to climb into the ring. This next picture, the next slide, is a picture of LA actually, taken mid-March, April, sometime not that long ago, but you can see the clear outline of the mountains behind the skyscrapers. Whether it was doctored a little bit or not, I don't know, but it's still a stark contrast that is in keeping with a Washington Post report today that carbon emissions are down 17%, almost 20%, almost 1/5, as a result of the slowdown in the economy during this pandemic. It's a stark reminder of what we can do. We don't want to stop the economy, but what we can do if we drive our cars less and other things, reduce our dependence on carbon. The part, as at the beginning of my remarks, a part of this interconnected context with the COVID crisis is the US relationship with China. This is a cover on another recent Economist that asks the question, is China winning? I thought it might be helpful here to first look at Americans' views on what's happening with American views on China as reported by the Pew surveys. There clearly souring. Americans' views on China clearly are souring, as well as their view of the leadership in China. Excuse me. 9 in 10 US adults see China's rise in influence as a threat. They link it to China's economic rise and its increasing global influence. Parsed by issue, they see concerns around the economy, military and security issues, climate change, and cyber attacks. I might note in 2019, it was climate change that topped their list of worries about China. Today, disease tops that list of specific threats, not just about China, but internationally. This change in American viewpoints, although it's been gradually moving in this direction since 2017, this change in American viewpoints is also somewhat of a partisan story. The Pew Trust survey results show that 6 in 10 Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents are unhappy with what they see the Chinese doing. 7 in 10 Republicans and Republican-leaning independents feel that way. So the difference is not great, but it is indicative of a change in the temperament among Americans toward China, and it is indicative of what we're going to see as a larger issue, I think, in the presidential election. Not whether to be tough on China, but which of the two candidates in the general election contest can be the toughest on China. The implications, in our next slide, the implications are clear for, can we have the next slide, Marcia? Yeah, there we go. Oh, I guess I can move this forward myself. The implications are clear for the US-China relationship. I'm gonna move it just one more slide. I guess I'm missing, this is the slide I'm looking for. It didn't have to end this way, writes a fellow named Stephen Roach, who is currently at Yale University. He is the former chair of Asia for Morgan Stanley and quite an astute observer about the China economy, the China political scene, and the China-US relationship. He lived it for most of the years that China, from 1998 forward, was on its reforms, economic reforms, and was in China for much of that, as much of it took place, playing an active role, I might add. But he says here that we didn't really have to get to this unhappy point where we're anticipating a major rupture in the relationship. We're still somewhat in the trade war. It's now toned down, where the damage is not going to be one side or the other. It's going to be really mutual in many ways. It is been at first a strategic decoupling driven by the Trump administration's position on China when they came into office. And it's deteriorated during the COVID crisis that we've seen with this blame game, with one side blaming the other for being slow off the mark in dealing with the rise of the disease. The two superpowers battling out their differences with little, if any, resolution in sight. There is one outcome that is perhaps the most likely, and that's in the next slide. Again, an Economist cover. This one, by the way, that Marcia's got on the screen is a graphic illustration, again from The Economist, showing the two superpowers in this contention. They can of worms, they can't make progress, they can't get out of it. It's really a mutual blame game. But let's go to the next slide. This is one of the obvious outcomes for international relations, and what we're experiencing probably below the radar for most of us at this point. It's a form of deglobalization. I don't think we'll ever get to the point where we're we're totally unwinding deglobalization, but we are seeing a change in how companies are using their supply chains and where they're sourcing their materials through their supply chains. And as a result, how these supply chains are organizing. And they are reorganizing rather than through China. They are reorganizing outside of China, so regional to China, with a separate supply chain inside China. And then they're also onshoring. And you had an announcement today, which I haven't had time to really read or study, but an announcement that the Trump administration has given a large subsidy to a Virginia company that manufactures generics for pharmaceuticals. And if you'll remember, there was this flap that we were so dependent on China for generics in our pharmaceutical supply chain. But that's what we're going to see, this onshoring of various industry pieces in the links in the supply chain in various industries. And they'll be largely pharmaceutical, technology, somewhat manufacturing around technology like semiconductors. It won't be wholesale, but it will be a dramatic shift. What's the outcome for you and me? Things are going to cost more. We are very dependent on China for low-cost goods, but things will cost more because these supply chains won't have the advantage, that comparative advantage that Economist talks about. When you have as many components in the competing, it tends to make the process as efficient as possible and as low cost as possible. That's gonna change, and that's what's gonna be part of the reason that our costs are gonna go up. According to Stephen Roach, the decoupling will leave Americans worse off today than yesterday, and we'll see it in the shape that deglobalization takes: delinking trade and investment, reshoring of supply chains, and like I said, starting today with the pharmaceutical industry. Let's have our next slide, Marcia. So this raises, I'm going to try to bring this to a close. I've been a little bit rambling, but it's because there's these elements that are they're intertwined, but they seem at first glance a bit disparate. And those elements, once again, are what's happening within our governance, what's happening with our politics, what's happening as a result of the crisis, and then what's happening in this key US-China relationship. This I'm going to skip down. What I'd like us to think about is, I'm going to skip down. Can we come? Is this the last slide, Marcia?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So I'm going to just come full circle because I'm aware that there's many people many of us on the Zoom who are very thoughtful about all these issues. I'd like to have some of your feedback, and I'd like to have some of your thoughts sharing with each other on where you think we are as a country, what our perspective is as a result of what we've been through with COVID, what we should be expecting from our politicians, what we should be expecting from as a result of this stimulus and in our economy. What are we prepared to do as a result? And I'm talking about the income, I'm talking about taxes, I'm talking about who we vote for, and then what we think our relationship with China ought to be. China is not going to go away. It's the second largest economy. It's intent on being a rising power. What should our relationship be? And then finally, it really comes to a point this year, I think, in what happens in November with the presidential election. And that's where I'd like to leave things back. I'd like to put things back to you. I'd like to ask you what your thinking is about where we are now, what our perspective is on America, and where we want America to go with this chance for an election come November, if that will make all the difference. So I'm going to ask if we can open it up and ask any of you, all of you, to give some thoughts, and let's have some exchange as best we can virtually. Who's first? I mean, I see a lot of thoughtful faces staring at me from the other side.
And we have one question.
All right.
If Joe Biden is elected, what does he have in his toolkit and how should he use it?
What does he have in his toolkit for what?
It doesn't specify. I don't know if Jane, you'd like to elaborate?
Yeah, it's just there are so many different problems that we face right now, and none of them have been dealt with very effectively. So if Joe Biden is elected, what resources does he have to use, and how do you see him moving ahead effectively to do a better job of handling all of the issues that we've just talked about?
Well, I think the key characteristic of the key difference between Joe Biden and Donald Trump is Joe Biden knows government. And if we are ever at a point, in my opinion, if we are ever in a point in our history of needing somebody who's skillful when it comes to governance, who understands government not only from a domestic perspective, but from an international perspective, then that's Joe Biden. I think Donald Trump has been a very interesting president. He has shaken things up. He probably gets credit for calling attention to the tilt in the relationship with the Chinese. But there is the way he went about it, scorning allies' input. That could have been so effective had he brought the allies around. But I think by and large, Trump has demonstrated time and time again, his lack of experience and his lack of understanding for what is governance and what governance takes. So I think that's number one in Biden's toolkit. Number two, I think there is a style of leadership that is critically different from that of Donald Trump. And that style of leadership is inclusive. And for me, it's inclusive in a way that's more American than Mr. Trump's style of leadership is. That's my opinion. It's not universally shared by any means, but I think, anyway, that's my opinion. And it's a style of leadership that's inclusive, both in terms of who he brings around him, but inclusive in also how he sees the values and the tenor of this country, what this country stands and what it is for. So I think he has some things that are going to be difficult, but I think he has those two things. He'll bring good people around him, above all. I think on the, it'll be interesting, you know, I'm so interested, of course, in the US-China relationship and the US-Asia relationship, but this is going to be a very interesting challenge. I don't think you will have the Democrats returning to what was in terms of the US-China relationship. What I mean by that is this accommodative relationship. If you look at the history of the relationship from a period of sort of 1998 to 2012, that's when the Chinese were really reforming themselves economically. And there was a kind of a grand bargain, if you will, between the Americans and the government in America and the government in China and the people and the business and the finance and the investment, a bargain that said, we'll look the other way given our ideological differences because there's economic benefit to be realized on both sides of that issue. That was starting to be questioned early on during the Obama years. It didn't originate with Trump. It was Trump who put the fine point on it, but it didn't originate with Trump. And I think we now are at a point where that we've seen the Chinese after, you know, it was back in, I don't know, 5 years ago or so, when they really started in serious ways to restructure their economy, to change how their economy was built, and shifting from a manufacturing base and an export-led base, shifting from that to more consumer driven economy, to having more technology that they make themselves instead of being dependent. In many ways, becoming more nationalistic, bringing things home and becoming less dependent in other ways, but changing in critical ways the structure of the economy. And in step with that, they also sort of refocused on their original plan from 1949 forward, and that is socialism. No longer even, I don't want to say no longer, but less so a market economy with Chinese characteristics, which was what they said from 2013 going forward, to now more of even just plain out socialism. And I think for the fallout things for China is, for us watching what's happening in China and for China, is you're going to see COVID contributing to even another step in that direction, where the state-owned enterprises get much more attention than the private enterprise. Now, Jean, I've gone on with that answer, and I apologize.
Thank you. No, that's great. That's great.
But you get me off the script and wind me up, and there you go. But there must be some other thoughts out there too. By the way, may I just say, Jean is a dear friend from my Stanford days. We were 1 year apart, but we were colleagues actually with the Distinguished Careers Institute program. So welcome, Jean. I'm glad you could join.
It's been really good. Yeah.
Okay. Who else has got a question? I can only see some of you, and I can see Sue Sprunk and Ann Shermack. I mean, come on, Ann, you know, what's your thought out there? Where do you see the world going? Oh, Sue, please.
You know, one of the concerns that I have is not just who's going to be elected president.
Right.
But when we look at the first responders and, you know, and their compensation versus a lot of other segments of society, when you look at the people who don't have the money to get them through a couple months rent or feeding their families, and they're now on the food bank lines. You know, I mean, I think we have some basic things that we need to address in terms of the middle class has been reduced. You know, and what is the value of different parts of the society and how we're compensated for it? And to me, that concerns me. I don't think that Mr. Trump is the right one to take us into that, since he hasn't demonstrated it in the last 3 years. But I'm not sure that Mr. Biden is strong enough to do it either.
Yeah, and the governors are now saying, unless there's some stimulus money that comes to state and local governments, that they're going to have to do layoffs. And where are those layoffs going to fall? The police and teachers and healthcare workers, and that's where it happens. But it really goes to the heart of one of the big problems in this country, and it has led to such difficult polarization. And now with the economic issues on top of things, it's going to be very hard to, you know, square that circle rather, between, you know, your economic need, what you need to put fuel in the keep the fires going, versus how you want your society to be. It's a very difficult place that we're headed into. I think it's not going to be over for years, but I'm very open to other ideas about that, and counter ideas too. If you disagree, I'm really in agreement with what Sue is saying. If you disagree, if you have other thoughts, please jump in. It's an open forum.
Marcia, I don't think that it's all China's fault. China, when I've been there multiple times, and every time I go back, I'm impressed with their progress. They started off as being very closed and stopped their people from progressing. And that changed over the years. And now they're allowing people to become middle class. I mean, it's amazing to me. There is the difference between the old China and the new China. And I think that that's what has to happen in the US. That we have to see a difference between the old US, which was where we were all about making a profit, and moving into being world-class leaders.
You know, one thing I just offer in response, Eva, and Eva, you're such a world traveler and such an astute observer in what you see in the countries you travel in. So I really honor that. But one thing I would offer, and I tried to in that comment about how the Chinese acted towards SARS in 2002 versus how they reacted to the COVID in 2019 to 2020. In both instances, while they were quicker off the mark with COVID-19 than they were in 2002, but in both instances, you had that period of time where the institutions of government, the politics of country, the traditions of the political system kept control on information that needed to be made public because it had to do with the health and welfare of citizens. They kept on to it and they held on to it because they are prone to secrecy. They're prone to control. And I think, yes, we have a new China and an old China, but I think we want to remember that there are many restrictions on expression, on assembly, on religion, but things that we have in our tool chest that have served us very well, that China could adopt. You know, they've certainly got, but they're not, it's not in their DNA. And that's that ideological difference that really has to be dealt with in one shape or form. How do you live together when your opinions are so widely opposing one another, what you stand for? And I think that's at the heart of the problem in the U.S.-China strategy. But the fact that they have come from where they were pre-1998 to where they are now is a miracle. I mean, I agree with you. We both were there when they were wearing Mao suits and riding bicycles en masse, and now they're not. But it's quite a different country. But they do have that. There is that key difference in how.
Maybe that's what we need. Maybe that's what we need. We need more strict control, because we have a president who is currently ignoring the pandemic, or has currently ignored the pandemic.
Yeah.
And who did away with the whole game plan that was laid out by Obama, I think, back when.
Mm-hmm.
And
Marcia, are you familiar with the book, The 100-Year Marathon, about China's push to be the center of the world by, 2050?
Oh,
And how did that begin at this?
Who's the author? Susan?
It was a former foreign service officer, China expert, who first was very friendly toward China, maybe during Clinton, maybe Ellen's getting it. The author is, he has tremendous expertise.
Tell us about the book.
Maybe Ellen.
Okay, I haven't read it. It's on my to-do list. It's written by Michael Pillsbury. And it says the subhead is China's secret strategy to replace America as the global superpower. Now, I have two comments about China. I mean, I started going there in 1985, Mao suits and bicycles. But there was an article recently in the Atlantic magazine written by H.R. McMaster that is, I think, rather brilliant and interesting about China. And I urge anyone to Google it and read it. But he also has a book out called Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free West. And just based on the intelligence in his Atlantic article, I'm going to buy his book.
Do. I think too.
Yeah, because I think it's got a lot of thoughtful stuff. I don't have answers. I have one other comment though about the Chinese economy, because I sourced out of China for years, and even in the 60s was sourcing out of Hong Kong. And the concern I have with China, or the observation, is that the US economy is a consumer economy based on, I hate to tell you all the things I just bought today at Target that were made in China. But surprised, I'm looking at the labels these days. But the thing is, the US economy may not bounce back. We consumers may not decide to consume so much. And that would affect China very severely and very quickly, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And that's question is, how will the Chinese middle class react to a sudden downsizing of their own wealth? And does that present an opportunity for the United States, maybe not relative to China, but relative to China's global ambitions?
Mm-hmm. It's a huge question. All I can add to it is that I think you're correct. I think the impact of a decoupling of the economic relationship and the strategic relationship hurts both sides, both the US and the Chinese. And the Chinese are still dependent for 20% of their GDP on their export markets. And that drop in consumer demand is already being registered in their Q1 and Q2. Q2 is not out yet, but it's already registering in terms of their growth rates. And so yes, it's going to make a huge impact. Will it be enough to force the Chinese out of their shells and out onto the streets and protest? Are they willing to face down the government infrastructure that has a hold and control on them? I don't know. I don't know how fresh still the memory of Tiananmen Square is or is not. The Chinese have taken some steps, additional steps, which I can't recount, but additional steps vis-a-vis Hong Kong in terms of bringing that people closer. There's been this series of arrests of the pro-democracy people in Hong Kong. So it's just hard to say who can win that game, but there's repercussions on both sides of the Pacific Ocean. I think that's clear. And on your book, on the H.R. McMaster book, I haven't read the book, but I read the Atlantic article, which is excerpted from the book. And there's a lot of Democrats paying attention to that book at the moment. He's at the Hoover Institution, by the way. There's a lot of Democrats paying attention, asking whether what he lays out as his thesis could be a strategy for the Democrats in the China relationship. So it's worth looking at it with that kind of lens on as well.
Just to sum up, 100-year marathon, which is on the book, The 100-Year Marathon, and I'm sorry, it's been a couple of years since I read it.
Yeah.
A fascinating recount of what is going on in China by a Chinese expert as to China's hidden strategy to be the center of the world in 2050.
Yeah.
And going back to their being the center of the world way before we were even a country.
Yeah, yeah.
And the steps they're taking economically. So I don't know how it fits in with what's going on now, because it was years ago, but it's fascinating and well worth reading.
Yeah, I can offer a little bit about Michael Pillsbury. I think he fits into the group of with the China hawks, and he's one of those who's raised the issue of fear about the direction China is going. Not so much how they're getting there, but the fact that that is where they're going. And it is kind of interesting that they are pulling their economy in to be less dependent. At the same time, they have a very active international strategy underway, both through their so-called One Belt, One Road, but then also you saw it during this COVID crisis with their so-called mask diplomacy, where they were quick to airlift masks to Italy, to European allies of the United States that were disgruntled with Trump or whatever they were, but nevertheless, they were quick to do that. And it's boomeranged somewhat on them because some of the equipment that was airlifted or that was sent was not particularly good quality. It was faulty. And then there came some public relation gaffes as a result. They just weren't very smart about sophisticated about how they went about doing it. But the Pillsbury book is good. And I think it was one of the ones early on to sort of put on the plate the issue about China's rise and what that meant for a complacent America.
And initially he wasn't a hawk, but he talks about.
Yeah, yeah, right. Terrific.
Thanks.
Marcia, hi, it's Nancy. I was just thinking about the Belt and Road project, and I was in Africa for the last 4 years, and especially in East Africa, you saw just billions of dollars of projects going up in Ethiopia and Kenya, and all along that east coast of Africa, all the way up back to China. And, it was just amazing to me to see so many projects, new cities being formed, 30 high rises being built in downtown Addis in Ethiopia. And you go, my God, they're never going to get paid for this.
Uh-huh.
I don't know how they're ever going to recoup that investment, because everybody says, well, they'll have access to what? You have to have some wherewithal and money to access anything in those countries. And it's in some of those countries where the places, the minerals and all the things they can have access to is very dangerous. And I mentioned to a State Department fellow that I know here in Palo Alto, and he said, yeah, they might have, people forget that what they're putting into Africa is just enormous. And they're probably not going to get paid back. And, I know American companies that are there that are not getting paid, and they're leaving the country because they go, we lost a couple $1 million. We're never going to get it. We're going to retreat. But, in China, they just keep plugging along. And you just wonder if they've overextended themselves. Maybe they thought, well, this would be an easy thing. We'll just build all these roads and highways and ports and railroads. And it looks pretty. It's great. It's very active. Provides low-level jobs in those countries, nothing middle class. And, but, the roads are half used. The railroads are half used. It's going to be a long time before they see any type of return on their investment. So do you have any, point of view about that project?
Well, I tend to think that the One Belt, One Road strategy was pretty brilliant, actually. The execution has not been so brilliant, but I think the idea of bringing infrastructure to the developing world is something that's badly needed and valuable. But the way that it was gone about, the sort of bait and switch, the outline of the contract would be such that we will build a port for you, and you'll pay us back over a period of time. And if you don't pay us back over the period of time, then we take control over that port with a 99-year lease or however, but we take control. That's what happened in Sri Lanka, and it's what's happened elsewhere. But these countries are so hungry to try to bring in money, to bring in foreign investment, and then to try to build up their economies to try to compete, that they have flung open their doors. It has worked to the benefit of the Chinese too, because a lot of the construction and a lot of the work done on those contracts is via the state-owned enterprises whose people and expertise is exported then to the countries. So it's not so much indigenous people or people within the country who are given jobs. They brought the people in to do the jobs. So it's a Chinese project by Chinese workers and so on. So that benefit hasn't been as clear as one might have thought. There has been a bit of a flap around the Chinese, I think it's the IMF. Anyway, they've been asked to forgive some of the loans during this period of COVID. And they've, as far as I know, still have declined to forgive any portion of those loans. And it's, we'll see how that plays out. But it's critical. And I'm curious, Nancy, from your experience, what you understood the people in Ghana or wherever you saw the Chinese projects going up, what the feeling was about the Chinese, what the reception was toward the Chinese, what the how they felt about having these projects done not by their own people but by other, how they felt about it being a Chinese project.
Well, it was interesting. It was mostly East Africa, and in Kenya in particular, all the low-level workers are the local guys. They didn't bring in millions of Chinese to, take the shovels and hammers and stuff. The people they brought were the management, the engineers, project managers, and that didn't go over well in Kenya in particular. They said, we have a lot of engineers here. Why are they not hiring? But, the Kenyan engineers were probably not capable, to tell you the truth. But the lower level people, the people from the slums, the day workers, they were all African. And that was very good because those are the poorest of the poor, and it gave them employment. There's a lot of signs on the buildings. This is, in English, because English is spoken in Kenya. This project is brought to you by the Chinese people. So there's a lot of propaganda. And so it's a love-hate thing. Africans see all these sky rises go up. I mean, they could be in Manhattan. I mean, these buildings are like so awesome. And a lot of the buildings are going up, education buildings. So I think the Africans, the people I know, the educated people go, well, thank God they're here. Where are the Americans? We never see an American project in Africa. I never saw an American project. We do nothing there. So our image, our reputation is sort of like not even in existence, which is very sad. And so the Chinese, maybe they haven't won the hearts and minds of everybody, but they certainly have done a lot more than we have ever begun to do. The other thing is there's some, bad taste. The Chinese seem to be prejudiced against a lot of the Africans, and you hear about this quite a bit. It's in the papers. So they have to be careful, and they send managers back to China if they are found, denigrating the African workers. So there's that tension, but it's not as bad as you would expect. I would say overall, I was surprised, and I saw this in Rwanda and Ethiopia as well. It's probably more valued by the Africans because they know if they didn't have the Chinese there building all this, they wouldn't have it at all.
Right. There's a forum I take part in Guangdong every November. And one of the principals is a former prime minister of Pakistan. And he has repeatedly talked in very glowing terms about the infrastructure investment through One Belt and One Road into Pakistan. Very favorable because of all the reasons that you're giving about Africa.
Yeah. So, I mean, for whatever their reason, right now, it's a positive, I'd say a net positive in most Africans' minds. And again, the Africans are saying, I don't know what they expect in return, but it's going to be hard for them to ever get paid in full for everything they're doing. Because it's billions of projects, billions of dollars of projects. It's overwhelming. When you go, you can't believe a whole new city with 100 new buildings.
Right. Right.
You know, high rises, 30 high rises going up at the same time in downtown capitals. You know, beautiful highways that make our highways look terrible. You know, so the quality of the work that you see is surprisingly good.
Mm-hmm.
And people are working.
Mm-hmm.
Africans are working.
Great. Do we, Marcia, do we have other people lined up? Are we?
Is it for questions that we were?
Marcia, I was just going to add that similarly, when we flew into Thessaloniki, Greece last year, we were surprised to learn the airport is owned by the Chinese.
Oh.
And on the COVID Chinese connection, I have a tennis friend who's of Italian heritage and very proud of it, but he was upset. He said the reason COVID came so quickly to Italy was the fashion industry is using Chinese to do all the clothing, and they're actually in Milan.
Oh.
So the Chinese influence is broader than we know, I think.
Right, right. That's an interesting idea, to track the lines of Chinese investment and Chinese business and industry worldwide, and then follow where the COVID outbreaks have been. Interesting thought. Do we have others?
I think we have to be cautious, but I think we have to be open-minded as well. And I'm very concerned that we're too cautious or blaming China and not being open-minded about the possibility that their intentions are not all bad.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, do we have any more comment or question, or should we close this off and seriously have a glass of wine?
Oh,
Barbara, did I see you?
Thank you.
Barbara, did I see you raise your hand? No.
He's clapping.
Oh.
oh, she's got me. I
Well,
love
Marcia,
that.
Much.
thank you for
Thank you
doing
all.
such a lovely job. I mean, you're always very insightful and provocative. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you. All right.
Marcia, very much.
Good care. Really. Take
Bye.